chosen one. Something in you finally refused to stay quiet. Not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of a deep internal knowing that had been building for far too long to ignore. And when you truly spoke, it didn't just land in the moment. It echoed. It moved through conversations you weren't part of. It reached rooms your body hadn't entered in years. It touched every place your name had been shaped, twisted, or quietly misrepresented. Because for a long time, you weren't being seen directly. You were being seen through something altered. As if invisible lenses had been passed around, subtle distortions handed out without question. And people accepted them. Not because they were malicious, but because the version they were given felt believable enough. That's how these things work. Not loud lies, not obvious attacks, but small suggestions, repeated just enough to feel like truth. And all the while you kept living your life unaware that a version of you was being constructed in parallel. A version shaped by fragments, assumptions, and carefully placed narratives. But those distortions were never meant to last. They had a breaking point. And the moment you stepped into your truth, whether it was saying no, walking away, or simply choosing yourself, something cracked, not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. The illusion didn't fade. It fractured. And now something deeper is happening. People are starting to question, to retrace, to ask themselves where their perception even came from. Because once clarity enters a space that was built on confusion, everything unstable begins to collapse. And what you think was just a small act of courage carried far more weight than you realized. It wasn't just a decision. It was a disruption. A shift powerful enough to unravel something that had been carefully maintained for a very long time. You can feel it already. The Two of Swords reversed. No longer allows blindness to remain comfortable as tangled branches part and hidden truths cut through the silence you once endured. Because this was never just about what people said. It was about what was hidden. And now, what was hidden is beginning to surface. 5 of Wands reversed. Shows you something crucial. The chaos was never random. The conflict was never natural. And the noise surrounding your name was not an accident, but a tangled web, slowly losing its tension. Because what you experienced wasn't just misunderstanding. It was design. Not loud enough to raise alarms. Not obvious enough to expose intent. But consistent enough to shape perception over time. Small comments dropped in the right moments. Questions framed just carefully enough to guide suspicion. Observations that sounded neutral but carried seeds inside them. And those seeds, they were planted patiently. You didn't notice it happening all at once. No one ever does. Because the strongest distortions are not forced. They are suggested. A raised eyebrow here. A subtle tone shift there. A story told with just enough detail missing to invite imagination to fill in the gaps. And once imagination gets involved, truth becomes optional. That's how a version of you was constructed without your participation. Not through evidence, but through repetition. And the longer it continued, the more real it felt to those receiving it. Because people trust patterns. Even when those patterns are built on incomplete information. But what you didn't see then is that this entire structure depended on one thing: your silence, your willingness to endure, your decision to not engage, your patience in the face of confusion. Because as long as you stayed quiet, the narrative had no resistance. It had no interruption. It could grow unchecked. But the moment you spoke, you introduced something that system could not handle. Contradiction. And contradiction is dangerous to anything built on illusion. Because once people hear something that doesn't align with what they were told, they begin to think. And once thinking begins, control weakens. Now here is where the shift becomes undeniable. Those same people who once accepted the narrative without question are starting to replay moments in their minds. Conversations feel different now. Memories don't line up the same way anymore. details that once seemed insignificant are now raising questions. Why did that sound off? Why did that story feel incomplete? Why did that person always frame things a certain way? And slowly, quietly, the structure is collapsing from the inside. Not because you're fighting it, but because truth has entered the room. And truth doesn't need force. It just needs presence. Which brings you to something even deeper. This wasn't just about what was said. It was about access. Someone close enough to observe you. Close enough to gather fragments of your life. Close enough to understand what could be used and how. That's why it felt personal. Because it was. And the realization of that is where the real shift begins. Not just seeing what was done, but understanding how it was possible in the first place. And once you see that clearly, you don't just break the illusion. You break the entire mechanism that allowed it to exist. Ace of Wands reversed exposes the moment where potential was twisted, where a spark meant to create became something that burned quietly in the wrong direction. Because this didn't come from a stranger, watching from afar. It came from proximity, from someone who had just enough closeness to observe your patterns, your struggles, your moments of openness. Someone who saw not just your strength, but your humanity. And instead of protecting what they saw, they studied it. They paid attention to what hurt you, to what you feared might be misunderstood, to the parts of your life you shared in trust, believing they would be held with care. But what was meant to stay sacred became material. And this is where the weight of it truly lands. Because betrayal from a distance feels different. It stings, but it doesn't penetrate the same way. Betrayal from within reshapes your understanding of safety itself. Now, here is where the internal tension begins to unfold. Part of you wants to deny it, to believe it couldn't have been someone that close, to convince yourself that maybe it wasn't intentional. But another part of you, the quieter, deeper part, already knows. You felt it in moments you couldn't explain, in the way certain interactions shifted, in the subtle discomfort that lingered long after conversations ended. That wasn't imagination. That was awareness trying to reach you before you had the language to understand it. Because when someone has access to your truth, they also have access to shaping how others perceive that truth. They know which details to highlight, which moments to remove from context, which emotions to exaggerate. And when done carefully, it creates something dangerous. A version of you that feels real, but isn't complete. And people rarely question something that feels complete enough. So what you experienced wasn't just misinterpretation. It was construction. Built piece by piece using fragments of reality, rearranged into something that served a purpose you were never meant to benefit from. And just when it seemed like that version would continue to exist unchecked, you interrupted it, not by exposing every detail, not by defending every accusation, but by standing in something far more powerful, your authenticity. And authenticity has a frequency that distortion cannot fully replicate. That's why when you spoke, something shifted instantly. Not everyone understood it right away, but something in them recognized the difference, because truth carries a consistency that lies cannot maintain forever. So what's happening now isn't just exposure of actions, it's the exposure of intent. And that is far harder for anyone to defend, because once intent is revealed, the entire narrative loses its foundation. And that's the moment everything begins to fall apart for the one who built it. The sun doesn't ask permission to shine, and neither does the truth once it finally breaks through the clouds that tried to contain it. Because what you're witnessing now is not just exposure, it's illumination. Warm, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The same spaces that once felt heavy with unspoken judgment are beginning to feel different, not all at once, but enough for you to notice. Conversations carry a new tone. Eyes linger differently. Energy shifts in ways that don't require explanation. And here is the deeper movement unfolding beneath the surface. People are seeing you without the distortion for the first time. Not the version they were handed, not the story they absorbed, but you. And that kind of clarity creates a quiet tension inside those who once believed otherwise, because realization doesn't arrive gently. It comes with contrast, with the sudden awareness that what they accepted doesn't align with what they're now experiencing, and that contrast forces a reckoning. Now here is where your internal shift becomes just as important as the external one, because as light returns to your environment, it also returns to you. You start to feel something unfamiliar, not because it's new, but because it's been absent for so long. Lightness, clarity in your thoughts, ease in your body, a sense that you no longer need to anticipate judgment before entering a space. And for a moment, it might feel disorienting, because you adapted to carrying weight that was never yours. You learned how to move carefully, how to read rooms before speaking, how to shrink just enough to avoid triggering reactions you didn't understand. But that version of you was built for survival, and survival is no longer the assignment. Now here is where the emotional tension deepens. Part of you may still look over your shoulder, still expect resistance, still prepare for misunderstanding. Because healing doesn't erase memory overnight, but something stronger is beginning to take root. Trust, not in others, not yet, but in yourself, in your perception, in your voice, in your ability to recognize when something feels aligned and when it doesn't. And that self-trust becomes your new foundation. Because once you trust your own clarity, no external distortion can hold the same power over you again. So what happens next changes everything. Those who once saw you through borrowed perception are now forming their own. And not all of them will respond the same way. Some will feel relief, grateful that the confusion has lifted. Others will feel discomfort, struggling to reconcile how easily they accepted something that wasn't fully true. And a few will remain silent, not because they don't see, but because admitting it would require them to face themselves. But none of that defines you anymore, because the light that's returning to your life is not dependent on their reaction. It's coming from alignment, from truth finally standing without resistance. And once that light stabilizes, it doesn't flicker, it doesn't shrink. It simply continues to illuminate everything it touches, including the path ahead of you. King of Cups stands in that quiet space where emotion no longer controls you, but flows through you like steady water that cannot be shaken by surface storms. Because now, Chosen One, the battle is no longer external, it's internal mastery. You've seen what was done. You've felt the weight of it. You've recognized the betrayal, the distortion, the manipulation. And yet, you are not reacting the way they expected. That's what's unsettling them. They thought exposure would break you. They assumed truth would trigger chaos in you. They expected anger, retaliation, desperation to prove yourself. But instead, you became still. Not silent in weakness, but silent in control. And that changes everything. Because emotional control is something they never accounted for. They prepared for conflict. They rehearsed defense. They anticipated arguments. But they did not prepare for your composure. Now here is where your power becomes undeniable. You are no longer trying to correct every misunderstanding. You are no longer chasing validation from people who once doubted you. You are no longer explaining yourself to audiences that never took the time to understand you. That version of you is gone. In its place stands someone who knows their truth does not require constant defense. And that calm presence, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. Because when someone is grounded in truth, they don't need to convince. They embody. Now feel the shift happening inside you. The emotional storms that once lived in your chest are settling. The need to replay conversations to analyze every look, every tone, is fading. And in its place comes clarity, a deep anchored knowing that doesn't fluctuate based on external perception. That is emotional sovereignty, and it creates a tension for those who once misjudged you, because they don't know how to approach you anymore. You're not reacting. You're not engaging in the old dynamic. You're not feeding the narrative that once gave them control. You've stepped outside of it. And when you step outside of a system, you expose it simply by no longer participating. So what happens next becomes even more revealing. Some will try to reconnect with you emotionally, not because they've fully processed what happened, but because your energy now feels different, calmer, stronger, unreachable in the ways it used to be. They will sense that distance, and they will want access to it again. But here is your test. Not everyone who returns has evolved. Some return because they feel the shift, not because they understand it. And this is where your discernment becomes your protection. You don't need to harden your heart, but you do need to hold your boundaries, because compassion without boundaries leads back into the same cycle. But compassion with clarity, that is power. Now here is the deeper realization unfolding. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming balanced. Your heart is still open, but no longer unguarded. Your empathy is still present, but no longer easily exploited. Your kindness is still real, but no longer given without awareness. And that balance is what makes you unshakable. Because now no matter who approaches you, you see clearly, you feel accurately, and you respond intentionally. Not from pain, not from fear, but from truth. And that is a level of power that cannot be manipulated again. Four of Swords reveals a different kind of power, the kind that comes not from movement, but from stillness, where retreat is no longer escape, but restoration. Because after everything that has surfaced, after the unraveling, the exposure, the emotional recalibration, your spirit begins to ask for something it was denied for a long time. Rest. Not just physical rest, but mental quiet, emotional space, spiritual recovery. And here is where many misunderstand the process. They think once truth is revealed, the next step is action, confrontation, resolution, closure through external means. But that's not your next assignment. Your next assignment is integration. Now here is where the inner tension softens. You may feel the urge to revisit everything, to analyze every detail now that clarity is present, to mentally replay moments with your new understanding. And that's natural, because your mind is trying to reorganize reality after being fed distortion. But there comes a point where understanding must give way to peace, because clarity without rest becomes exhaustion. So what you're being guided into now is intentional stillness. Not isolation born from hurt, but solitude chosen for healing. A space where no one is defining you, no one is observing you, no one is interpreting you. Just you, returning to yourself. Now feel what begins to happen in that space. Your nervous system begins to calm. The constant scanning for judgment starts to fade. The need to defend yourself dissolves without effort. And something deeper starts to rebuild. Trust in your own inner world, because for so long, your energy was outward, focused on environments that felt off, people who felt unpredictable, atmospheres that required constant awareness. But now, you are coming back inward, and that inward return is where your real strength is restored. Now here is where the shift becomes even more profound. You begin to realize that not every truth needs to be spoken aloud. Not every realization needs to be shared. Not every person needs to be confronted. Some things are simply meant to be understood and released, because closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it is a decision, a quiet one, a final one. And in that stillness, you begin to reclaim something you didn't realize was taken. Your mental space, your emotional clarity, your ability to exist without constant internal tension. And that reclamation is sacred, because from that place your next steps will not be reactive. They will be intentional, and intention is what separates healing from repetition. So as everything around you continues to shift, as conversations unfold, as truths continue to surface, you are not required to chase any of it. You are allowed to pause, to breathe, to exist without explanation. Because this moment of stillness is not the end of your movement. It is the foundation of your next level. Queen of Swords rises in that quiet space where emotion has been processed, and what remains is clarity that cuts clean through confusion without hesitation. Because rest was never meant to make you passive. It was meant to prepare you to see without distortion. Now here is where everything becomes precise. You're no longer trying to understand what happened. You already understand. What changes now is how you interpret people. You begin to notice patterns you once overlooked. The way certain words are chosen, the timing of certain actions, the subtle inconsistencies that used to slip past you. And this time, you don't explain them away. That is the shift. Before you gave the benefit of the doubt, even when something felt off. You softened your instincts to maintain connection. You ignored your own clarity to preserve peace. But now, peace is no longer something you preserve externally. It's something you protect internally. And that requires honesty, not harshness, not cruelty, but truth. Now here is where the internal tension sharpens again, because clarity comes with a cost. You start seeing people as they are, not as you hoped they would be. And that can feel isolating. Not because you're alone, but because your standards have changed. What you tolerate has shifted. What you allow has narrowed. What you accept has become intentional. And that creates distance. But this distance is not loss. It is alignment. Because every connection that requires you to ignore your clarity is no longer sustainable. And you feel that now. In your body. In your reactions. In your silence. You don't need long explanations anymore. A moment is enough. A tone is enough. An energy is enough. And from that awareness, your responses become simple. You disengage. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just intentionally. Now here is where your power becomes undeniable in a new way. You are no longer reacting to people. You are selecting them. You are deciding where your energy goes, who receives your presence, who has access to your inner world. And that decision is no longer influenced by guilt, because you understand something now. Access is not owed, it is earned, and once lost, it is not easily returned. Now feel the shift this creates in your environment. People who once approached you casually become cautious. Those who once underestimated you begin to observe you differently. Those who once spoke loosely become more measured, because clarity changes your presence. You don't need to confront every lie. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. Your discernment alone creates boundaries, and boundaries reveal truth faster than confrontation ever could. Now here is the deeper realization unfolding. You are not becoming distant. You are becoming precise. You are not closing your heart. You are refining your access points. You are not losing connection. You are choosing alignment. And that choice is what ensures that what enters your life next will not be built on distortion. It will be built on truth. 4 of Cups reversed marks the moment you can no longer remain disconnected from what you truly feel as the numbness lifts, and the stillness you once hid inside begins to break open. Because before this, there was a kind of silence within you. Not peace, but pause. A place where you stopped reacting, stopped engaging, stopped fully processing what was happening around you. You told yourself you were fine. You told yourself it didn't matter. You told yourself you could just move on without looking too closely. But that wasn't resolution. That was protection. Now here is where the shift becomes real. You are starting to feel again. Not in a way that overwhelms you, but in a way that wakes you up. Moments you once brushed off now carry meaning. Interactions you ignored now feel clearer. Emotions you pushed aside now rise without asking permission. And it's not comfortable at first, because when numbness fades, truth returns with it. But this time, you are not shutting it down. You are allowing yourself to see, which brings you to a deeper realization. You were never confused. You were just disconnected from your own clarity for a while. And now that clarity is back. Now here is where the internal tension surfaces one last time. Part of you may wonder why it took this long, why you didn't see it sooner, why you stayed in certain spaces longer than you should have. But listen carefully. Chosen one. You were not late. You were processing at the pace your spirit could handle. Because if you had seen everything all at once back then, it would have broken you in a way you were not ready to recover from. So your system did what it needed to do. It slowed things down. It softened the impact. It gave you distance from the full weight of the truth until you were strong enough to hold it. And now you are. Now here is where everything opens. You are no longer rejecting what is being offered to you. Not opportunities, not connections, not clarity. You are becoming available again, but not in the way you were before. Before you were open without awareness. Now you are open with discernment. Before you received without questioning. Now you receive with presence. Before you allowed access too easily. Now you choose what aligns. And that difference changes your entire reality. Because openness without awareness invites distortion. But openness with clarity invites truth. Now feel what is happening energetically. You are no longer sitting still, emotionally withdrawn, disconnected from what you deserve. You are re-engaging with life, not out of need, but out of readiness. And that readiness creates movement. New conversations begin to feel different. New opportunities feel lighter. New connections don't carry the same tension, because you are no longer entering spaces from a place of depletion. You are entering from alignment. And here is the deeper truth unfolding. You didn't just break free from a false narrative externally. You broke free from the internal state that allowed it to linger. You are no longer unavailable to your own truth. You are no longer avoiding what you feel. You are no longer sitting in emotional limbo. You are present, awake, engaged. And from that state, nothing false can hold you again. Ace of Pentacles reversed enters here as the moment you recognize that not every opportunity was truly meant for you, and not every door that seemed closed was actually a loss. Because now, chosen one, you begin to see something you couldn't see before. There were things you wanted that were never aligned. There were paths you tried to walk that would have cost you more than they could ever give. There were connections you thought you needed that were quietly draining your future before it even had the chance to unfold. And when those things didn't work out, you thought something was being taken from you. But now you understand something deeper. Now here is where the shift becomes undeniable. Some opportunities were blocked not because you were unworthy, but because they were built on unstable ground. And had they succeeded, you would have been trapped inside something that looked good on the surface, but carried the same distortion you just broke free from. This is where divine redirection becomes visible, not as punishment, but as protection. Now here is where the internal realization deepens. Think about the things you once chased, the approval you once wanted, the spaces you tried to fit into. the people you tried to stay connected to. And now look at them with your current clarity. Do they still align, or do they feel limited? Because what you're realizing now is this: you were never meant to build your life on what was available. You were meant to build your life on what was true. And those two things are not always the same. Now feel the emotional tension releasing again. There is no more urgency to grab every opportunity. No more pressure to prove yourself through external validation. No more fear of missing out. Because you are no longer operating from lack. You are operating from alignment. And alignment changes the way opportunity works. You don't chase anymore. You recognize. You don't force doors open. You wait to see which ones open naturally and feel right when they do. Now here is where everything shifts into a new level. You begin to understand that what didn't come into your life was never truly yours, and what is meant for you will not require you to shrink to prove or to ignore your own clarity just to hold on to it. This is where your standards rise again, not out of ego, but out of self-awareness. You are no longer accepting things just because they are available. You are only accepting what reflects your truth, and that changes your entire trajectory. Because now every step forward is intentional, every connection is chosen, every opportunity is evaluated not by how it looks, but by how it feels in your spirit. And that is something no one can manipulate again. Because you are no longer searching for something to fill a gap. You have already filled it by returning to yourself. So what comes next will not be compensation for what was lost. It will be confirmation of who you have become. Judgment reversed speaks into this moment as the quiet realization that not everyone will awaken to the truth at the same time you did, and that is no longer your burden to carry. Because for a long time, chosen one, part of you believed that once the truth came out, everything would correct itself, that people would understand, that clarity would be immediate, that justice would feel clean, direct, undeniable. But now, you are seeing something deeper. Not everyone is ready to face what they participated in. Not everyone is willing to question what they believed. Not everyone has the emotional maturity to confront their own role in misunderstanding you. And this is where the final release happens. Now here is the internal tension that must dissolve. The part of you that still wants acknowledgement. The part of you that still hopes for full accountability. The part of you that wonders if they will ever fully get it. Listen carefully. Some will, some won't. And that truth is what frees you. Because your liberation was never meant to depend on their realization. It was always meant to come from your alignment. Now, here is where the shift becomes absolute. You stop waiting. You stop watching for reactions. You stop measuring your healing against their behavior. You stop tying your closure to their awakening. And in that moment, your power becomes complete. Because now your peace is no longer delayed by anyone else's process. Now feel what happens when you fully accept this. The emotional cord that was still connected, however subtly, finally loosens. The invisible expectation dissolves. The lingering attachment to their perspective fades. And what remains is you. Unburdened, unattached, unapologetic in your clarity. Now here is the deeper realization unfolding. Justice does not always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as separation. Sometimes it arrives as silence. Sometimes it arrives as the simple fact that you see clearly now, while they remain where they are. And that is enough, because your role was never to force awareness. It was to step into truth, and you've done that. So what happens next changes everything. You move forward without needing resolution from the past. You build without referencing what was broken. You connect without carrying the fear of being misunderstood again. Because now, you trust your discernment. You trust your timing. You trust your ability to walk away the moment something feels misaligned. And that trust is the final piece. Chosen one. The narrative that was written against you has collapsed. Not because everyone agreed, but because you no longer live inside it. And that is the true erasure. And now that you no longer live inside the narrative, something quiet settles over everything that once felt loud. Not emptiness, but space. Space where confusion used to echo. Space where you once questioned yourself. Space where other people's perceptions used to hold weight. And in that space, you finally hear your own voice clearly again. Chosen one. This is the part no one prepares you for. Freedom feels unfamiliar at first, because you got used to carrying something. You got used to anticipating tension. You got used to explaining yourself in your own mind. You got used to scanning rooms, reading energy, bracing for what might come. And now, there is nothing to brace against. So for a moment it might feel but don't mistake that feeling. That is not emptiness. That is peace returning to a place that was once occupied. And as that peace settles deeper, you begin to recognize yourself again. Not the version shaped by misunderstanding, not the version reacting to distortion, but the version that existed before any of that ever touched your life. The version that doesn't need to prove anything. The version that doesn't need to fight for clarity. The version that simply is without explanation. Now breathe in that awareness, because this is where your life begins to move differently. You are no longer navigating based on what people think. You are no longer adjusting yourself to fit perceptions that were never accurate. You are moving based on alignment, and alignment is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't chase validation. It doesn't need confirmation. It simply guides. So as you step forward from here, you don't carry the past as a wound. You carry it as awareness. You don't carry betrayal as pain. You carry it as discernment. You don't carry misunderstanding as something to fix. You carry it as something that revealed who was truly able to see you and who never could. And that changes everything. Because now, you don't need everyone to understand you. You only need to remain true to what you know. Chosen one. This was never just about clearing your name. This was about returning to yourself. And now that you have, nothing false can follow you into what comes next. So walk forward without looking back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer has power over where you are going.